Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good night. No, not good night, but good evening, depending upon when you're watching this video. This is Module 1, Week 3, Part 1 of a U.S. historical perspective on how did urban form in our cities get to where they are. And for this first video, we're just going to be looking at the 1800s to 1959. I'm going to try to stay on point here. A lot of moving parts, and this is an overview. So here we go. That's, of course, if it will let me. Okay. So a couple things that we're going to be looking at is we are landscape architects. We are architects, or soon to be landscape architects or architects. And focusing on this idea of community engaged design, focusing on our cities. So we're really going to be looking at our urban experiences, which the definition of is relating to, characteristics of, or consisting a city. So morphology, for the purposes of this, really trying to look at this idea, the study of structure or form. Form is important in what we try to do. The structure, you know, the ecological aspect of cities, whether it is constructed or natural, really becomes important. So we'll be thinking about structure, we'll be thinking about parts, we'll be thinking about the formation of these things and what have been the different influences on this in terms of the resulting morphology, the economic aspects, the social aspects of it, the environmental aspects. So this is really where we're going to be trying to do an overview that will help us as we dig into sort of where things are now. Cities are always the physical manifestation of the big forces at play: economic forces, social forces, and environmental forces. And so we really need to have a grounding in where we came from with these things, so it really helps us as we move forward. So our objective in these two is to really kind of just get a basic understanding of site design theory and the influence of it on urban morphology, and then also what have been those catalytic economic, social, and environmental influences that have caused our cities to be the way they are. So we're going to look at the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. I think that's a good place to be started. In the 18th, then the beginning of the 19th century, only 5% of the U.S. population was in urban areas. And most of areas consisted of a 1 mile radius. Rural areas, you know, were essentially a network of general stores with access. It was very much agrarian in its trade and its economy. And as you can see here with our map from the city of Philadelphia, we'll be using historically Philadelphia since it's where we're going to be vetting our ideas at the end. I think it's a good place for us to be able to start. Here you can see the layout of the city originally, and you can see its trade business is heavily reliant on the rivers. And the Delaware River, which goes to out to the Atlantic Ocean, then really is where everything started, even though the city was laid out on this north-south city grid. So, things we want to think about as we look into this. One of the things that definitely started to happen, and I'm not sure where these blue lines came from, the City Beautiful movement. So there was, as the United States started to grow, very much a desire both from an economic but then also from a social standpoint to create that beautiful city, that experiential aspects of these cities This is an image from the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And a lot of it was coming out of this explosion in the 19th century from 1800s as the Industrial Revolution started, a lot of unregulated growth, which really resulted in bad social conditions. Also, it was interesting that during this time, U.S. towns started to exceed a population of 2,500. So we started to see larger towns. It wasn't just this urban-rural dichotomy anymore. Another good example of this, it was this sort of the Industrial Revolution and its social ills was not just in the United States. London, in England was experiencing the same things. So an example, Garden City by Ebenezer Howard. This is 1898. Here we're looking at this idea of satellite, self-contained communities that provide an economic infrastructure, but then they have a strong social component in terms of quality of life, how people live, and then also have a strong ecological focus in terms of this idea of green grass, open space, forests, stone quarries. So very much this sort of a decentralized response to the city form of our industrialized cities. We also saw a lot of work going on with the settlement movement. We had massive migration into inner city areas, a lot of this concept of creating settlement homes where middle income individuals could come into poor areas of the city and provide sort of an assimilation to help them understand how to integrate into the United States, how to get jobs, getting into schools, and really trying to look at how can you deal with this dichotomy between mass immigration and these poor areas within the cities. This was a youth settlement in St. Louis. So we did see during this period a strong social response to what was going on in city areas. Concurrently with that industrialization, there was the movement of the creation of the railroad. So 1840, we started to see, as we were just mentioning, U.S. towns growing. We started to see the advent of the horse-drawn streetcars. So this idea of mass transportation, of trying to deal with the inner city areas, and how do you develop a different system given the density that was starting to occur in these areas. Probably the biggest thing, though, by the mid-19th century is the railroad, and in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad. This really did allow for massive immigration and industrialization. And it was during this time that the U.S. urban population rose from 3.5 million to 22 million. So it really was the advent of the train and the railroad that really allowed for the urbanization of this country. This is the railroad system in 1870, just as an example. A couple other things from a morphological standpoint. This is Riverside. It was a community designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, and it was another sort of these social reforms that looked at an aesthetic construct that would provide a more natural, more so focusing on human well-being. So this one was this combination of a stratified scenario where your lower economic and rail-dependent housing units were alongside the rail, and then upper income, upper economic stratus of residential units. And again, this is looking at the idea of the single family home, not the apartments, not the more urban townhouse environment. And these are laid out then in these very organic shapes. Those organic shapes are very much based on the horse-drawn carriages and street-head cars that are moving at a much slower rate and a much lower volume of cars in that scenario. So we do start to see then an increase as we move into the later period within the 19th century, moving into the 21st century, the advent of the car and this idea of maps. And because the condition of so many maps was so poor, we started to see things like the geographic good road map. If you were wealthy enough to have a car, you needed to know which of the roads you could actually ride on. So we're starting to see, one, this idea of an influx of people into the city because of rail. And then we start to see this opposing movement that is income-based, of individuals with money and the wherewithal to be able to individually drive out into the city and other parts of the country. So interestingly enough, here is another map of the city of Philadelphia. When we were looking at this map before, this was that zone in the beginning of the 1800s. So we are now just beginning the 20th century. As you can see, a huge amount of growth in the city in that 100 years. You can also see we are still very much trade dependent along the river. You can see in these areas rail and the importance of rail bringing things in and out of the city. And we can see definitely sort of that, our city grid as it evolves and shifts from just the Jeffersonian grid to one that's aligning with the rivers and running parallel with those. But it's a massive, massive transformation. And yes, 100 years is a lot of time, but incredible influx of individuals into the city. So just as an example, this is what we were looking at for the rail system in 1870. In 20 years, by 1890, this is that increase in rail and the rail infrastructure within the city. So we're moving now into 20th century. We have streets that are cities heavily reliant on an urbanized grid, heavily reliant on rail, both from city to city, intercontinental, as well as transportation. The streetcar within these individual cities. Other types of morphologies, Le Corbusier very much looking at, and still this idea of urban form that's looking at the economic conditions, but also looking at social issues. And Radiant City in reality is is the forerunner of what has been called, and we'll see in the 60s, the projects, how to deal with inner city areas, how to deal with blight, this idea of the creation of the high rise that moves people up. The concept, though, here was this idea of extreme centralization that was bringing nature back into the city. And it was also about social organization. Each one of these buildings and these structures was a very egalitarian approach. You lived, you worked there, you had open space all around you. And so it was this idea of extreme efficiency in your life. Everything that you did happened within this building, this object. And it really assumed that this would resolve all the social issues that were going on during the time. You also had individuals like Frank Lloyd Wright during the same period trying to look at other types of visions for sort of urbanization. Wright is a little bit more along the line of Garden City and Ebenezer Howard, looking at this idea of extreme decentralization. This really sort of brings in economic, social, and ecological. And here, for the first time, there really is this idea of ecological. There is this idea of looking at urban agriculture, and the first person to, I think, really to kind of bring that in. So, and in a lot of respects, some of the aspects that Wright had in here, we're starting to see more of now. It was also one of extreme decentralization. Every family had an acre of land, and they were allowed to grow and self-sustain themselves. It was very much a democracy that way. Of course, you had flying ships for transportation. But it was this idea that you had this amazing self-sufficiency in terms of living off of the land, which was something you did not see much of during that period. So we have a lot of people trying to come up with what is the vision of the city of the future. And then, of course, the Great Depression hits. And, that a lot of things happen to the city form as we know it, and starts to mark, this really does start to mark the decline of many of our inner cities. With Philadelphia in the 1930s, it began a decline in population that did not turn until 2010. So we're going to start to see that slow erosion of the United States big industrial cities: Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Buffalo, Philadelphia. Just to name a few are ones that definitely suffered from this. One of the things that happened was that interurban rail systems were leaving. And of course, for a lot of people, that really made it difficult in terms of economic stress on trying to find work or find food. In a response to this, one of the things that we did start to see is the creation of the Bureau of Public Roads, which was to start to create the whole Depression-era road projects. A lot of this was based on the idea of, we got people out of work, we got to do something. And so everybody decided to focus on roads and not rail, which is pretty interesting. But this is that beginning of the shift within the United States in terms of this idea when we're in an economic downturn, when we have an economic problem, build roads. And to this day, that's what we see. We still see with every economic crisis, there's major road building that happens as opposed to major rail building that happens. And this is where that trend and that culture of that came from. The other thing that we start to see is this idea of federal housing. And the Federal Housing Act of 1934 was supposed to improve nationwide housing standards. So it was started based on a social good, which has started to have a lot of impact economically. And it was to provide employment, to stimulate industry, to improve conditions with respect to mortgage financing, to realize a greater degree of stability in residential construction. So it was an economic stimulus that was framed in the idea of a social good, but it really was driven mostly by economics. So then let's just throw World War II on top of this. And we throw World War II on top of this because there are several things that happened, and we'll do this quickly, but with World War II came an incredible industry around petroleum. We had an unprecedented amount of ships, submarines, aircrafts. Fuel was critical. And so this incredible industry in a very short period of time was created to service the war. So what do? The war's over, and we've got all these battleships, and we've got all these aircraft carriers. We have that are no longer operating, and yet we've created this huge industry around petroleum and fuel. So what do? Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to sign into authorization a network of rural and urban express highways called the National System of Interstate Highways. You got that industry was not going away. And so a lot of people decided that building roads was the way to go, because that's fuel and asphalt is petroleum. And there we go. Then you see also at the same time, you've got this Federal Aid Highway Act of 1944 to create a 40,000-mile highway system. So this starts to have impact on urban form and the decentralization of cities, and we'll start to talk about that a little bit. So what else was happening? Well, not only then was there then a corresponding increase in the need for cars, because suddenly we were building roads, which meant we could have more cars. It was easier to get around. But somehow we need to do something about making sure that people use cars more. And so that's where between 1938 and 1950, what we saw was General Motors and other automobile companies were convicted of a plot to purchase and dismantle streetcar systems in order to monopolize surface transportation. So there was a very conscious shift in the United States to move away from rail, to move away from mass transportation, and to support this new economic business of cars and roads, and eventually of freight on roads and not on rail. Only Newark, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, New Orleans, and Boston have been able to maintain their streetcar systems. It's another reason why I like using Philadelphia as our precedent later on, is because it did manage to keep those mass transportation systems. Pretty interesting phenomena. Other things. So we are seeing also the Federal Housing Act now of 1949. Interestingly enough, this is post-World War II. It is increasing its ability for mortgage financing. It is starting to look into long-term security for financing. So in one respect, it's increasing the opportunity for vets to buy more single-family homes. And then it's finding ways to have more federal funds for public housing. But there's a big difference between those mortgages for the single-family homes and what those public housing projects look like. Single-family homes, this is then basically the beginning of the suburbanization of the United States. The suburbs, the Levittown is the most famous of those. These are World War II vet. You can get incredible prices for a home. These are suburban, and this is basically creating this move to say, you, predominantly white, young war vet, get married, buy your little suburban house out here with other little suburban vets and predominantly white residences, work in the city, but live out here. So this is, in effect, the beginning of white flight. This is the beginning of an economic stimulus package that allows a certain demographic of our city of a certain demographic of our country to move outside of the cities and be given a great reason to do it. You get your own house, you're in open space, green space, you get to use your car, your wife gets to stay at home and take care of the kids, and that's what it looked like. That's Levittown. And these little boxes were designed in such a way that you could adapt them and grow. Notice the sizes of the street grid and layout for these. We're not going to spend much time in the suburban world, but this definitely creates this shift of population away from inner city areas. So you have a decrease in rail, an increase in the automobile, and you have a beginning of a shift in a demographic within the cities. So archetypal American characters, sharing the same way of life, values, religion, beliefs, ethnicity, and living standards. And this is where it all starts back in the 50s. Federal Aid Highway Act of 1952, there's an additional $25 million, which in 1952 was a lot of money to continue building roads. By 1954, there's another $175 million to build more roads. And then we get Dwight Eisenhower as president. He, in 1956, just in case we haven't got enough money going towards roads yet, we are going to do an interstate program. And this was always presented as a military concern, that you had to be able to move tanks and military across the city and across the country in the event of a war. And so this was $25 billion to create 41,000 miles. And it is our interstate highway system as we know it today. This is when it began. So we go back a little bit more and talk, because where this is important for cities is this idea of that demographic shift. And the show I Love Lucy, for those of you who know it, actually also reflected this. The show began in the 50s. This is I Love Lucy in her apartment in New York City, because that was very much that urban, very European way of living, flats, apartments, and then suddenly what we see is even I Love Lucy moves to the suburbs, and so we really start to see that trend then by the end of the 50s of the suburban way of life as the American dream. We're going to stop there.